So, Craig, thank you so much for coming back. And I think today the key agenda is to try to think about how coaches make the decisions that ultimately they try to motivate people to follow through with, right? So, it's no point trying to motivate people to follow a decision that's ultimately terrible. So we'll talk about how we make decisions and what biases people succumb to, and how we can best help leaders learn to navigate those biases so that they're less likely to succumb to them over time. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, it sounds good. Yeah.
So I guess to put this in context of the sorts of decisions that people face and the sorts of areas where bias creep in, what do you think are some of the hard decisions that leaders have to make?
Well, I think, look, some of the basic decisions that a coach needs to make on a regular basis, or a leader, is on recruitment or selection. So if we take that, step back to which players do you recruit, or if we're in another high performance setting, who do you recruit into your environment that you're working in, into your team? So if we look at sport, for instance, you have player recruitment, but you also have staff recruitment. So they're critical areas that we need to get right. And we also know in the workplace, in a high performance setting in the workplace, I think one of the major limitations is recruitment and who is recruited. Because once we recruit problems, they're not going to get better often. Yeah.
So you think you get the right people surrounding you, and a lot of the other decisions might get made for themselves or get made well, right? But if you make some bad decisions in recruitment, pick some bad players, pick bad leaders, pick bad sports scientists, you've made a mess for yourself.
Yeah, and I often have this discussion with coaches that, they might tell me player X is a terrible player, and then you think, and you might want to ask them the question, didn't you recruit them?
Yeah.
So where's the problem there? The problem is in the process of your recruitment process. So and that decision making. But then you got basic selection week to week. How is that done? And I think often what I've seen in high performance sport is the strategy around that is, I think, problematic. There's a lot of subjective behavior and as we're speaking about today, bias that comes in.
So there's a lot of biases in not only who coaches will pick to have around them in the team and in the club, but in terms of who they'll put on the field and who they put on the field first. Those sorts of things you don't think that they're sort of reliable decisions. There's often people, where biases are creeping into how they make those decisions. Is that right?
Absolutely. I think, if we go right back to where does bias come from, it starts with the ego. And if the ego is that strong, and I would say we all have ego, obviously, but it's self-awareness. There's no problem with having that, but if you're not self-aware enough to check your own decision making, then we've got a major problem. And again, in my experience, particularly in high performance sport, I think the absence of self-awareness is significant in coaches. I don't know if it's particularly in male coaches, and you wonder if it's basically a masculine thing that I need to be right and I will not show any vulnerability, and it is my way or the highway. It's seriously problematic.
If you can't see problems in your own decision-making strategy, then, or even stop to look at it, right? Stop to actually critically evaluate it, then it's pretty hard to improve your own decision-making. You know what I mean? If you're just this is my way, I've got it right, this is what you pay me the big bucks for, right? And therefore you think you're right all the time, then it's hard to actually stop it.
And if you've got no decision-making model and you're not critically analyzing yourself, then that's a problem. And that's for all of us. If you're a sports scientist or you're a strength and conditioning coach, an assistant coach or whatever, anyone in life, if we do not reflect on how we make and come up with decisions, then we're going to have problems.
No, I think that's really wise advice. I'm just taking a couple of notes as I go along. And I guess that there's one other sort of decision-making domain that we haven't really covered across yet, which I think is important. And I think it's important because the processes might be really different. It's like the in-game, in the heat of battle kind of decision-making. Because ultimately that's what coaches are doing on the day, right, Craig? Like if, yes, they make a lot of decisions about setting up the team strategy and who they pick and who they put on the field on a particular day. But they're also making decisions in the heat of battle, aren't they? And that's almost a different beast.
It's a great point you raise, and I've been involved with some decision-making processes on game day, or what you think about a game day coach and how they are. And the major sport I work in, football, soccer, coaches on the sideline. Remember, and we know from research what happens in a game and what a coach perceives happens in a game. And if we look at memory of that game, it might be only 30% you're taking in. And I've been in situations where I think the coach has been caught up in the game and has lost their thought process, particularly in respect to substitution being made and then tactical changes that might be made. But that's what your damn assistants are for. They're the ones there. But if we've created a culture of groupthink and no one wants to challenge the boss could be standing up there, missing something, plain as day. And if you do not have a good coaching team behind you and you've created a good culture, then there's problems. I remember having this conversation with a coach that I was consulting to, and I was seeing that they had not made a critical substitution as fatigue increases, etc. And you've got substitutions, and they went into extra time. Still, they were fortunate to get to extra time, but they gave up a lead. But still, in football, remember, 3 substitutions are allowed. They had 2 substitutions. So they got to the end of the game with 2 substitutions. So they were able to use those, but they were leading with only a few minutes to go. And they could have used that because substitutions bring energy. And I remember just asking the question, did any of your assistants even suggest that to you?
And they hadn't.
Well, the thought process went on in their eyes, thinking, well, why are you asking me that? Well, the reason I'm asking you that is because do you have an echo chamber sitting behind you that is too concerned? Because all I could think while I'm watching this game, why are you not using the substitutions?
Yeah, like if you've got players fatiguing and you've got two cards up your sleeve that you can do to bring more energy onto the field, why is that not happening? And you're saying by asking that question, you're really tapping into how much is this coach sort of in an echo chamber where they're not receiving or not open to sort of hearing other perspectives.
And there was multiple times seeing this, that they, often the authoritarian type coach, the very strong character, just by nature surrounds themselves with an echo chamber because people do not want to challenge them. And if you're that type of leader, you've got to make sure that you're aware of that so you do not allow that to happen, because that's what you're going to attract, because there's fear. And I've had a number of occasions where people have said to me that observed me speaking to a coach in respectful terms, wow, I've never seen him challenged like that. And I said, don't you understand, the most powerful people, what they want is actually to be challenged. That's what you're paid for. If you are not able to give your insight, then what are you being paid for?
If you're just coming along and like saying, oh, you're doing a great job, you're right on, and not providing any change, then you're a waste of money as far as they're concerned.
Well, it's like a friend, Michael, that, it's like a friend that always tells you what you want to hear rather than those that really tell you what you need to hear. Yeah.
Well, and I think we all want people who do tell us when we've got spinach in our teeth, right? When we've got, you don't want to be walking around with this blind spot.
Yeah.
So I want to come back at some point to that distinction between sort of in-game decision making and then sort of the more reflective decision making. But you also what you mentioned there was like that you've worked with some coaches who you feel like have encouraged diversity and whatnot. So like I guess have you got any good examples of some leaders who have made some decisions in a way that you think went really well in a difficult sort of situation?
Well, I had an experience in December last year. I had this wonderful month that I spent in New York, and I have a friend that works for the Brooklyn Nets in the NBA, and I was able to observe them quite closely and observe the decision-making processes in a particular game of the head coach. And if you're not familiar with basketball, there can be multiple timeouts when a game is close in the last couple of minutes. And this was one game where I think there was 7 timeouts in the last 2 minutes, and they ended up winning. Brooklyn ended up winning. But I saw after each of these timeouts, the timeout was called, the coach walk away from the playing group to be surrounded by his people, okay, so his assistants and his analyst, for him to take that information in and then go back to the playing group and then give the whatever play they were going to do. And I was lucky enough to see him the next day after that and speak to him. And I said, I was so impressed that how calm you were going away, getting that information and then coming back. And he said, well, that's where the trust comes in. I want to hear what they've got to say from multiple angles. And then for me, then to make the decision what to call. And they got it right that day, and they were able to win that game. And it was I think an assistant called the play that they wanted in the last couple of seconds to win that game. But what I liked was the calmness about that. And I do have great respect for basketball coaches. I think they seem to have that model very well compared to a sport that I'm mostly involved in respect to soccer, where it seems to be there isn't that connection, and maybe it's because of the timeouts, but very much a collaborative approach, even though he will still make that decision in the end.
But in a way, he's separating sort of the process of actioning the decision once he comes back to the playing group with the process of making the decision when he goes over to his people and his team. And he's not just thinking about it and making a decision with the first thing that comes to his mind. He's checking those assumptions. He's widening up his sort of options of input. And also I imagine sort of like having a bit more composure, being able to sort of step away without sort of feeling like the players are there waiting for you to have an answer. That sort of adds a certain amount of pressure, but just being able to sort of step away and make that decision can, reduce that like intensity of the interaction. Is that what you like?
Yeah, and absolutely. I mean, the best coaches, it's getting that that arousal level right as well, and I know I've definitely been in situations, and I remember it's always stayed with me that one of my staff said to me, it was a pre-game, a very big game of an organization we were working with, and I was making sure everything was right, like in our sports science area. And I saw the look on his face, and I said, "You're right." He goes, "Oh, I just call it the Duncan effect." I said, What does that mean?" And he said, "Well, your stress goes into me and goes into them." And I went, "Oh," and that was a number of years ago, and it's always stayed with me like, oh, hang on, this is really important. That's not what I want to create. But if I'm thinking along those lines, if I've just got my focus on getting this job done, and it's very much the same with coaches, they have to understand that their behavior will infiltrate into the playing group. On the reversal side of that, I've seen halftime talks by coaches where they are so under-aroused, like they're so low-key,
just sucking the energy out of the team.
I can't always talk about things that have happened because you can put dots together. But I saw one where I remember sitting there in the dressing room going, "Craig, you've got to focus on your face because you've got those cameras in you." Because I was like, "What the hell?" Where it needed a talk to go, okay, this is what we've got to do. We've got to go and win this battle over the next 5 to 10 minutes, and we will win this game. Where it was more like, okay, guys, we're doing okay, and we'll be okay. And then sure enough, the players, a young playing group, in a major contact sport, went out going, oh, we're okay. And sure enough, it wasn't okay. So that sort of stuff I think is very important. to read the room, and thinking fast and slow is a good example of this, isn't there? There's times with coaching where you've got to think fast, but you've got an opportunity to think slow.
And look, that's actually what I was going to try to bring in as our sort of working model for a lot of this discussion, is sort of the idea of that system 1 and system 2 thinking, right? Which is where, for those of you who aren't familiar with this, who are listening, it's like system 1 is your fast system that's automatically making quick judgments. It's when you're driving, it's the one that changes gears for you, even though you're not really paying attention. If you're driving a manual or on your bike, like it's the one that's helping you balance. But your system 2 thinking is the part that tries to, I don't know, do 23 times 7, where like I just don't have a number come to my head.
Yeah.
But it's the one that like processes that. And I guess like the really hard thing is that like I think athletes are so reliant on system 1, and that's fine. That's what the whole of sports training is kind of about, is getting your system 1 refined so that it's making the right decisions a lot of the time. But I don't know about you, Craig. It seems like coaches are very like a lot of their hard decisions, like picking a player to join the team or picking a sports scientist to work with them, even picking the best, starting 5 in basketball or the best starting 11 in soccer. Like what's your system 2 is the one making a lot of those decisions. Would you agree with that characterization, that a lot of like coaches' jobs, a lot of athletes' jobs are system 1, but a lot of coaching ones is around system 2?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I suppose I haven't thought of it in that regard, but then you could even make the connection that most coaches come from players. So it's a problem, isn't it? Because they've got to relearn how they actually go about thinking. And it's interesting you say that, because I've seen system 1 thinking impact on what needs to be a system 2 decision. And what does that mean? It means, well, okay, player, we're talking about selection. Michael was rubbish on the weekend. He played terrible. Based on what? Because maybe you saw him make a mistake early on in the game, and then you've made that decision that will then impact time and time again. These crazy perceptions that are made of, subjective decision making, when there is objective data, but because of the coach's bias and their staff's bias, that we get these terrible decisions made.
Yeah. And I'm just I'm going to make a note to come back to that. And I guess I want to digress. This is where I want to bring in a bit of some of the stuff that I've read about the science of this, which I think is really interesting. So there's these two bigwigs and they disagree a lot. Like Craig, you mentioned system 1 and system 2, and as you know, that's like Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and they won a Nobel Prize for this. And they're all about how people make mistakes in decision making. Then there's this guy Gary Klein. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's led the whole like intuitive judgment is the right way to go. And like he'll study firefighters who go into a burning building and just get a feel like something's wrong, and so they run. So their system 2's going, just get out of here, Mike, like what's going on? And sure enough, they run out and the whole building collapses and no one can figure out what they noticed. There was this great paper, which I'm actually going to suggest the students read if they want to, which is sort of where Gary and Danny Kahneman have an argument about when should we be using intuitive judgments and when should we be using, deliberative thinking to try to overcome bias. And they actually agreed on everything. The biggest factor that they both agreed made a difference is getting accurate feedback from the system that you made a good decision or not, right? So nurses get really good feedback all the time about whether or not their judgment about a patient's right, because the patient will do well or poorly, and they figure that out in like 24 hours, you know? And there are some parts of coaching that are probably like that. Like when you're having a chat with a coach and or a player, and you're trying to, I don't know, talk the player off the edge because they want to punch one of their mates. Like you get very quick feedback about whether or not that's working. But a lot of feedback cycles in coaching are really long. Like if you pick a player and you expect there to be a growth phase, but when do you realize that that player is a failure? That could be like next year. That could be like 2 years from now, and
that's a huge financial cost.
Exactly. Yeah. And then you've got the sunk cost, right? Because you've spent, hundreds of thousands of dollars on this player to this point. You don't want to sort of throw that out and then try to grow someone again. And I guess what I wonder is like, how fast are the feedback cycles for a lot of these coaching decisions? Like, do coaches learn straight away whether they've made a mistake, or are they things like, player selection that, or which things do you get fast feedback on is maybe the better question. Like, when does a coach get really quick feedback that they've done the right thing? And when is it sort of more like the coach doesn't figure out the result for, a week or so?
Well, look, I think if we're talking, sports science, with technology, we can get really good feedback, live feedback in respect to, okay, training, the training, well, the way I structured training is that this is the training model for today. We have live physiological data coming in. Are you inside that model? Have you met the model that we've all agreed on? Okay, yes or no. Feedback is there. I've been in situations where they've gone outside that model, and that you might advise them that we're going outside that model, and then they've gone outside that model, and the feedback is there that this could be a problem. The next question is, do we know many coaches that are that aware and that, I suppose, humble enough to identify when they've actually made a poor decision?
Yeah, right. So you're saying that the feedback's there, but in a lot of the times, if the coach is structuring a training session, they will learn whether or not players are meeting the intensity that everyone's agreed on.
Yeah.
But some coaches may have that data and then ignore the fact that they've totally missed the mark. Is that what you're saying?
Well, absolutely. And I'll give you a wonderful point about that is, you can identify what training should be on a number of variables, GPS variables, but also I always like the subjective variable of RPE. I think that works in well with the objective data. And then you have a playing group say, okay, that session was a 7 or an 8, quite a hard session. But then coaches say, no chance it was. That wasn't that. That was a 5. And it's like, coach, it's a subjective variable rated by them, not by you. Yes, coach's RPE is important because that's how you can predict. But when the data comes back and it goes, it's an 8, and coaches, we've probably gone a little bit hard for this playing group. Oh no, there's no way it was an 8. It was only a 5. It's a very difficult argument to have. Because you're like, like it's a nonsensical argument from the coaching staff. It's a rate of perceived exertion by an individual. If they're rating it an 8 and you've got the whole squad pretty much rating it there, then we're telling us that's an 8. But there's a nice example.
That's but like what you're saying is they've got feedback, but then their own prior belief about how hard they designed it to be has influenced what, like, their reading of data and just totally biased it. So like, they're like, nah, it's not an 8. Like what you're saying, Craig, that's I hear what you're saying. It's almost like they're ignoring what is the true value. The true value here is what the athletes overall say it was. And they're ignoring that because of their belief about how sort of hard it was supposed to be. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. But Michael, I'll get back, and I'll say this time and time again during this course and in life, and it might sound like a broken record, but the ego of us as every individual is such an enemy. And just for me, because I'm been involved in high performance sport, it's like collectively the biggest collection of ego that you'll ever see, and where it isn't recognized as the enemy.
Well, it's almost seen as adaptive, right? Like, I mean, a lot of people have, I think one of the top 10 shows of Netflix at the moment is, Michael Jordan's, 10-part The Last Dance. And like, you see, like the biggest criticism that, the people I've talked to have had is that, God, he's got a big ego. But a lot of people are like, well, that's, like, he rightfully had a big ego as the best basketball player in the world, and it helped him, and that's how he was so successful.
And he helped so many others along the line to get the success they had. I mean, I don't know, just on that journey of watching that, people said to me, oh, Jordan was this and that. Jordan was nothing different from what I would expect him to be. In that. I think what was great, and I'm sure we might touch on this, the leadership qualities of Phil Jackson were outstanding. And his adaptability, and you could see that what a wonderful leader he was.
Yeah, I think we should definitely almost do a whole chat on Phil Jackson. Yeah. If we sort of come back to some of the things that you were talking about the kinds of mistakes that coaches are making, you're saying that they've got data coming out of their ears if they want to, And a lot of them may not be using that as part of their decision making or responding to that feedback. And so as much as your judgment improves with feedback, it's available, it's just sometimes not getting used. So what do you think's going on there? And I guess broadly, like, what are the sorts of biases that you think coaches are most likely to succumb to?
Look, I think confirmation bias is probably the major one I see. That they have a thought process, and then they want to see that confirmed, and they will do anything in their way, I suppose, to confirm what they already believe. And
right.
Rather than challenging where did that belief come from, that they will just go out and try. They'll have a hypothesis, and they will do everything they can to confirm that.
Okay, so they'll have a belief about the strategy the team should be using, or the sorts of drills that get to the outcomes that they're trying to achieve, and will just look for the data that confirms what they believe, rather than go in with a more of an open mind or thinking more critically.
Absolutely, 100%, Michael. And I think that's a real, obviously it's a major problem, because there is no real reflective process. And just that question, could I be wrong?
Yeah.
And to really look at things like reflecting on how has that process gone, or even what I love to do is a pre-mortem. Okay, an analysis, or having a red team as such to come in and poke holes in a strategy.
So these are fabulous, Craig. So maybe let's dive into these now while we're here, because I think these are really important for us to talk through. So the problem is that people are just finding the evidence that supports, or looking for the evidence that supports their argument. And, this is like the equivalent of searching Google, I don't know, is vitamin D good for me? And often you just get a yes at the top of the list, right? Because there's one page that says that. But you mentioned a couple of strategies there that might help kind of overcome this. One of them was, could I be wrong? Just asking yourself that question. But you mentioned a couple of other things, which are pre-mortems and red teams, and people talk about devil's advocate. Can you kind of walk through these just for people who might not be familiar with those?
Look, the red team is very much what is used in military. Okay, so if a strategy has come up for a battle or some sort of operation as such, a red team will be a group, or it could be a couple of people, or it could be another team that comes in and goes, how do we beat that? And this is how we beat it. And then by doing that, you can see holes in your strategy and then try and fix it up. It's very much the same. We all know what a post-mortem is. You die, you get cut up, and we find out why you died. A pre-mortem is identifying what will kill you. And so we should all do that in our life. Okay, what's going to cause your death? More than likely, you can look at family history, you can look at a number of things, and you could come up, and then we can start stopping that happening. It's exactly the same with a strategy you have in sport. All right, what is everything that can go wrong? Let's stop that happening before it actually happens, and we can solve that problem. But to do that, you've got to be so open and to be aware that you could be wrong. And I'll use an example. I remember in 2017, when I was working for the Australian national team, we didn't qualify straight away for the World Cup. We had to then go into a playoff situation. One was against Syria, home and away, and then the final game was against Honduras, home and away. Now, Honduras is a long way away, and there's enormous sports science issues that were about this game, about travel, playing in heat when most of your players are coming from Europe, where it was winter at the time, and then we had to play in 30 degrees in a very difficult country with high crime rates, a passionate footballing nation, but plus the travel. And then we had to play there, and we had to travel back in Australia and play a few days later in Sydney. So when you're putting that plan together, okay, from a sports science perspective, first I gather as much information, as many experts as I can in respect to sleep, travel fatigue, and all that sort of stuff. I can't rely just on myself. All right. I'm going to go into my network and find out all that information. And then I'm going to put the plan together. I put the plan together and then whiteboard it and go, what's everything that can go wrong? What is every little detail that can go wrong? And then you try and plug that hole.
Right.
And it's about being open that this can happen. And look, these things don't always work out well, but in this situation, yes, it did work out well. We won and were able to qualify. However, there were even times when I was in Honduras and remembering we had a chartered flight back, which I pretty much had control over, when the lights were on, when the lights were off, altitude, all these different things, which way were we going to come back? I even questioned myself there. I went, hang on, have you got this right? Go back to your notes, back to the plan, check it over and over again. Now look, to students, it's what level do you want to work at? Not everyone does that, okay? But for my own self, it's probably best practice. Also, it takes a lot of anxiety away from me because by doing that, and that's what red teaming is about. And I do not understand why it's not done more often. I do not understand when we analyze an opposition that we're going to play on a weekend with the tactics that they have. What we should be doing is analyzing us with those tactics and really going, this is how we beat you.
You're sitting there watching footage of another team going, how are we going to beat them? You're almost saying like, we should be thinking, how are they going to beat us, right? And let's try to fill those gaps.
Yeah, and I've seen this situation because I've worked for a nation, and then I worked for coaches working for another nation, and the analysis of one nation that I was working with in a game that I was involved in and looked at that analysis went, oh my goodness, look how easy we were to beat.
They've found all of our holes. But we should be able to do that ourselves. Yeah.
But shouldn't we be doing that? But is that, yeah. I mean, Nick, is that human nature that our ego doesn't allow us to do that?
Well, I think you're just walking a tightrope. Not a tightrope. It's just people struggle to hold two things in their mind at the same time without going nuts. I think there's a quote about that, which I'll probably dig up.
Yeah.
But what you're trying to say is that you need almost like a healthy level of doubt without it spiraling into anxiety. And that's a hard thing for people to wrap their head around, is that like you want to be looking for points of failure so that you can plug them. But how do you reconcile that with this sort of, I don't know, it's almost like this unfallible kind of or infallible persona that people want to see in an athlete and a leader sometimes. Do you sort of see what I'm saying? It's like, we very rarely admire athletes for saying, God, they're full of self-doubt.
No, but I think actually to take you a step back, you talked about anxiety. This actually takes away my anxiety because I'm prepared. And it doesn't have to be that I might be doing this with my team. A leader can do it with their team. They don't have to do that out in the media, and nor does a player need to do that. And I think it's a healthy balance of working with the players to understand that this is going to take you to that next step.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're just doing rational contingency planning, right? Which is
absolutely, like, to put it into perspective, if we take something a little bit more personal, if I was advising people that were getting married, I would be saying to them, okay, I want you both to go away and then identify everything that's going to make this marriage fail.
Yeah. It's a great idea.
In some respects, what people do, we know financial, we know this, and this could, but to really drill down into that, what are we fearful of?
Well, I don't know if people actually do that though, Craig. I think it's a really good example because it's something everyone can relate to. And to give you some interesting statistics, if you ask newlyweds, what do you think your odds are of a divorce? Like they say 0. It is 0. That's the average. The average is 0, which means no one ever says, oh, I think it's the base rate, which is 40%, right?
Yeah.
Like we know on average that 40% of marriages dissolve, but when people, get engaged and get married, they think it's 0. And what I think you've tapped into is it's almost like this fear of acknowledging the potential truth of the matter, which is that, yeah, okay, there's a chance. There's a 40% chance, and you guys might be better because of all of these reasons. But let's at least entertain the idea that there's a chance of this. What could go wrong so that we can be in the 60% group rather than ignoring the truth and ending up in the 40% group and getting blindsided by it. So you're sort of saying, like, acknowledge the problems that could go wrong so that you can fix them, which does reduce your anxiety, rather than just have them be there anyway, like the skeletons in the closet, and not do anything about them. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. And that is leadership. A leader, and look, you know me, I'm an optimist. But if I do not look at everything that can go wrong, then I'm not doing my job. I'm not doing my job. And I say this time and time again to people I consult to or work with, that it's okay. It's okay. We can make mistakes, but let's look at those mistakes we can make and then try and stop them before they become catastrophic.
Right. So there's two parts to that. One is, if you make mistakes, how do you learn from them so that they don't continue to happen? But two, how can you identify the mistakes that might happen in the future so that you can avoid them happening in the first place?
Yeah, look, I don't think sport's rocket science, is it?
But it is. I think it is emotionally difficult to open yourself up to the likelihood of failure, especially in sport, where, like, if you look at the bookies odds, like, it's almost 50-50 that you're going to fail a lot of the time.
But then you've got to look at what success and failure is, and then you look at,
that's true.
Okay, so you do look at coaching and you go, okay, look, I mean, obviously it's results driven, but I think it starts back from our kids and how we parent and all that sort of stuff. It's like, we do not encourage failure. We encourage safety, and we encourage cover up, and we encourage this where we should be going out. All right, let's look. Failure is part of life. We're not God. We're going to actually fail, but let's have a look at trying to reduce that. It's basically, if we look at coaching and look at our decision making, it's basically risk, isn't it? Managing risk and being aware of that. It's like, okay, at the moment, it's a good example, COVID-19. What are we doing? We're managing risk. These are the potential things that can be problematic. Let's put these processes in place. Okay, it's exactly the same with leading in high performance settings. What could go wrong? All right, and let's stop it there, or try it.
So that's a really great solution there, Craig, and you've actually tapped into a few, which is like, there's a really good book by Chip and Dan Heath called Decisive, and one of their key sections is just being willing to be wrong, just like preparing yourself for the fact that you could be wrong and you could fail, and you're going to learn from that if you approach it right. And I think we've really kind of covered a lot of that, and I think these are critical processes for addressing that major bias, which is like confirmation bias, and also echo chambers and groupthink, which we've talked about sort of in the past. So I guess what I'm trying to think about here is, like, are there any other strategies that when the rubber hits the road you've found useful for making kind of really good decisions? Or like, and maybe sort of aligned to this is, like, how do you create a culture where if you have a leader with a strong ego, these processes can still get implemented? Like, how do you do this? How do you start this safe conversation where you're like, okay, here's all the things that could fail and here's how we're going to address it, when you've got maybe a culture at the moment that's a little bit high on the ego factor?
Well, I think you have to be smart in understanding human nature. Most people, and when I've been in this situation, particularly with very high ego-driven people, is that there is an enormous amount of self-interest in there, isn't there? So they have to see what's in it for them, okay, which is one of the most important things, that they can see what is in it for them. The other thing is, with very ego-orientated leaders, if they think it's their decision, it's going to probably get over the line. So it's a matter of building trust first. building trust and building the relationship. It goes back to that simple thing. No one cares how much you know if they don't think you really care. So they have to see that you're a supporter and a loyal supporter. Every place I've ever worked, I've always been loyal, because that's the job. That's the coach I'm working for. I'm there to serve them and serve the players. When I don't feel that, I'm out of there. I'm out of there, and I won't stay there. Do not make the mistake of being that physiotherapist, that sports scientist, that assistant coach that's there talking to the coach, to the players, and backstabbing the guy at the top, because that is wrong in itself. So, but then you'll have to work with that, so they gain your trust and gain your insight, and it's feeding little bits of information where they can see. And sometimes you just got to get the small wins before you can get the larger wins. Basically, we're all in it together, aren't we? That it has to be a shared purpose, that we're working towards being successful with this team, and we're not pulling in all different directions. So you've got to leave your ego at the door and think, okay, why am I trying to get this information to this coach? Is it for their benefit, or is it just for me to get one-upmanship on the physiotherapist? That sort of thing. No, you've got to test why you're wanting to do this. But it's very much about building relationships. That is key. And sometimes it's very difficult with a strong coach. And I've worked with a lot of very strong coaches with big egos, and most of the time you can get the message across, but it might take time, and it has to be the message that makes a positive difference.
So there's a bit going on there, and I want to make sure I've kind of caught all of it. That one is that you need the team to sort of be on a common mission, right, and have clarity about what everyone's trying to achieve, and you need that in combination with a degree of trust. And I'm sure those feed into each other, but the trust is so that you don't feel like anyone's undermining each other, that if people are willing to speak freely and know that they're not going to just get their head chopped off. And that trust takes time to develop through, incremental levels of sort of impact, and so you might, start with a smaller set of suggestions to begin with if you're new to a team. And then they trust your suggestions because they're sort of the most useful things, but also you trust that you can have your say and not, again, sort of get your head chopped off. And you're sort of saying there are circumstances at which, like, some of those components aren't there, and, you might feel like, well, there's not a fit here for me. But if you've got those three components, then you can really have those safe conversations and trust that everyone's on the same vision and the same mission. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely, Michael. And look, one of the things I speak to a lot of sports scientists about when they say to me, oh, they just don't listen to me. Well, that's your problem. Because you have to make the narrative or your communication style worth listening to. So
and they haven't focused on the what's in it for me there either. Like if they haven't made it something I care about.
Yeah, so there is nothing in a coach's contract that says they must listen to the sports scientist or the physiotherapist. It doesn't say that. Okay, so we need to work very hard at our skill if we've got good insight to give. Look, if it was easy, like if you want a head coach just to listen to everything you say and it just be easy, then what would be the point of hiring someone of a higher quality? Because
and look, I think we should spend a whole thing at some point talking about how to communicate clearly and persuasively, because like you said, you can be the best sports scientist in the world, or I've had some great medical doctors who have probably given me the right advice, or physios who've given me a good program that I just haven't done because of maybe it wasn't persuasive enough, it wasn't clearly communicated, etc. So I think that's really good to touch on. I guess I want to throw some ideas at you from things I've read in other domains and see how they might apply in how you think they could apply in sport. So I mentioned earlier Danny Kahneman. He talks about the way that organizational boards should make decisions, and he says the problem is it's usually a bit us about. So he says a lot of the time, the board will rate a decision, say they want to acquire another company, and they rate it on a scale out of 10, and then they have all these sub criteria, and then the sub criteria like are biased by that overall decision. So if you like the company you want to acquire, Craig, and you're the chairman, you'll be like, yep, definite 10. Look, all of the other criteria are 10. And it just, he says that it leads to sort of the bias carrying over. And so he kind of suggests flipping it around. And the technique's called like multi-criteria decision analysis, where you go, okay, what are the things that we're optimizing for here? Like, what are our key criteria? And that it could be performance outcomes, but you might also say, okay, we want the team to perform well. We want the players to be motivated. We want we want to play a entertaining style of football because our fans matter to us. And like, what are the things that optimize all these criteria? Yeah. And so basically breaking decisions down into like, what are the key things that we need to decide on? Like, what are our criteria for these decisions? And then rate the overall decision after all. Like, what do you think about that idea, and how would that apply to sport? Have you seen that used?
I think it would apply very, very well to sport. Have I seen it applied? No. And I think it could only apply if someone like yourself was involved and in fostering that understanding. And I think it definitely has merit. And I see that more and more where coaching needs to go to. I actually do think there's a real niche for coaching advisors in this sort of to help with the decision-making process. Because do you know what? They just wouldn't be aware of that. Yeah, they wouldn't be aware that there is another way. And I don't think the education of coaches is really sufficient enough for them to go into a really big leadership role. They'll do their coaching courses and they'll do that, and there will be someone teaching them somewhat about leadership, but there's no ongoing teaching of leadership. So unless someone is well read and continues to stay updated, there isn't many coaches that I would know that would have a feed of the local research, the most research that's coming regularly, and having a Google Scholar feed coming and hitting you with the latest article. So what happens, Michael, is that they continue to do what's being done by their peers.
Yeah. And so like if there's an idea or a strategy that their peers have used, that's what they do. They might not look for alternative ways of going about the process of making a decision. Yeah. And I actually want to come back to that because, one of the first strategies is widening your assumptions or widening your options, because people sort of always talk about decisions as yes or no. And I think I want to actually hear from you about how you've done that. But I guess I just wanted to make one final point on that multi-criteria decision analysis thing, is that like, this is something I now use all the time myself, because there are times when I really want to do a project and I can feel that it sort of inspires me somewhere, but I actually know that it's probably going to be too much work for what the benefit is down the track. And I've now got a decision tool that's based on Kahneman stuff, where I've got 6 criteria. Say 3 of them are like, is it important? Is it neglected? And is it something I can actually do something about? Like, am I one of the best people to do this? And if it fails either of those 3, which it often does, my decision tool says, no, Michael, stop taking on projects, you idiot, which I think is like, I need that. But no, I catch myself really wanting to bias those judgments because of my sort of I don't know, my heart rate goes up and I get excited when I think about the impact it could have, not realizing how massive a project I'm sort of proposing. So I'll just get your reflections on that before we jump on to
Well, I'm going to ask you off air for you to send through that decision making tool. You know me quite well, and I've always respected that you do make decisions very well. I always knew when we were 2 offices apart that I was probably the worst thing for you, because I just come knocking on the door all the time. But we had that good relationship where I really respected that you had times where it was deep work and all that sort of thing. But yes, if anyone needs that, because I get inspired by everything. But then why that's a good decision-making tool is because if you can't do it to your best ability. You're going to do a bit of a half sort of quality job, and that's a problem. I found one that really works with me is, and this helps me with meetings, and I get a lot of people wanting a meeting with me, or wanting this, or wanting to chat.
Can I buy you coffee, Craig? Yeah,
that's really nice. But Derek Sivers, I don't know if you're aware of Derek Sivers, and he's got a couple of wonderful little TED Talks, which I don't know if they come into this, but Derek Sivers is a highly intelligent guy, and he had this thing, I heard it in an interview, because he stopped having any meetings or any of this, and how he did it was, if it wasn't a hell yeah, I want to do that, it was a no. So that's one that I do now. If it's not a hell yeah, it's a no. And I think it's a little bit cheaper way of what you're doing. But gee, it's really at least resonates in my mind with some of my decision making as far as where my time goes.
Yeah, no, I love that, Craig. And as an homage to Derek Sivers, my decision tool says hell yeah when I score 9 on all of the criteria. I'm not kidding. And one thing which I hope you'll enjoy is that it's actually got 3 criteria. It's got hell yeah, it's got no, but anything in the middle band is to send a peer review. And in that, what I do is I'll say, like, here's the idea. I'll send it off to a mentor. I'm like, can you rate this project on these criteria? Yeah. Because I know that I'm not objective, whereas, like, I know people like you will give me the honest opinion about, like, how it would meet these criteria or not. So I guess, but I want to come back, because what we haven't really addressed is what, the Heath brothers were talking about, is some of the key first processes in decision making, which is that, like, a lot of the time we face these decisions thinking they're yes or no, and sometimes they are. Like, if I've got a project idea, I will often say, okay, yeah, I've got either doing this or I'm not. Like, I'm in or I'm out. I'm hell yes or I'm no. But sometimes that can be a really, like, high stakes way of making a decision. And to use your sort of marriage and relationship example, people often think about, should I leave or should I stay? But it's not, like, as simple as that, because there's have a trial separation, there's go through counseling together, there's keep things exactly as they are, there's let's move house and try to address this core problem, which is the fact that we're trying to renovate this piece of shit or whatever. So how in sport do you come up with those extra alternatives to widen your options when you're trying to make a decision, rather than just like a yes or no? Well,
for one, it's awareness. The awareness that a lot of us just look at the world in black and white. And it's it's binary, and it very much isn't. And if we if we're looking at recruiting a player, it could be yes, no, or if we don't get this other player, this could fit the mold. Do you know what I mean? That, like, we have to look at these multi-dimensional aspects. If I've learned anything of life, it isn't a one-size-fits-all life. It isn't, there isn't often that one decision, yes or no. There is that gray area. And I think the more we can get into that gray area, the more we might be able to get some great outcomes. So I think, Michael, the number one is to be aware of that bias. I don't know, do we call it a binary bias? That we've only got a yes or no sort of decision process in place, where we need to just sit back and look at it and go, okay, it's like I'm very much into life, where I look at things, what I can control and what I can't control. But there is another aspect to that. So they called that the dichotomy of control.
Yeah.
Yes, I can control it. No, I can't. I can't control it. Then I don't need to think about it. But it's really a trichotomy, isn't it? Because there are some things you have somewhat control over.
Can influence, right? You can influence but can't control, Yeah.
So I think that's how we need to look at it. So everything that I think in leadership is firstly being aware that there's a whole big world of different tools that we've got in our toolbox that could be used at different stages, and to be aware of how much we're biased by our past, our environment, by the role models that we've seen. Remembering our leadership role models say more about us often than they do about them. So
No, I like that. I remember you saying that last week, and it's like, I think it really is insightful who you sort of look up to. But what you're sort of saying is that there's this natural temptation to sort of treat decisions like a flip of a coin, but almost in every circumstance there's more than one option. And you're just saying, just even being aware of the fact that, am I framing this as a yes or no decision? Am I saying this as one of two options? Yeah,
the flip of that, Michael, is, but we do as leaders have to make decisions.
No, I think that's, and one of our strategies for dealing with this is to separate the decision making from the process of generating options. So, when we're trying to overcome a really difficult decision, we'll often say, okay, here's the problem. Here's the problem. And the problem isn't yes or no, do we pick this player or not? The problem might be, okay, we've got a fairly weak forward line, right? And then we will often try to use brainstorming sessions to just generate a ton of solutions. And what we're trying to do is separate out create a safe space to come up with shitty ideas, because you can generate enough shitty ideas and you actually probably get a couple of really, really good ones that you wouldn't have thought of otherwise.
Yeah.
And so I don't know whether that, it sort of links a bit in with what you were talking about creating a safe space to put forward an opinion that's could be criticized. But I sometimes find just carving out a brainstorming time means that it is that safe space where people realize, okay, my ideas aren't going to get criticized here. Even if I'm the youngest person on the team, I can just throw something at the wall and then we're going to make the decision later. And that's where the leader comes in and says, okay, of all these options, if we look at the criteria, this is the one that ticks everything. You know what I mean?
Yeah. It's actually interesting what you just say on player recruitment. Just on that, is that often player recruitment's done back to front rather than sitting about looking at what does the team need. It looks at, okay, the agent has come in and said this player is available, and but does the team need that player? And then we've had those great instances in history where you might have 4 or 5 great players that don't work together as a team because they became available. Then we've got a problem, rather than the team looking and going, this is the formation we want to play. This is the type of player that we need for this position. Now let's go and have a look on the market.
Yeah, so what you're saying is, like, a lot of the time people aren't starting with the problem, they're starting with the solution to see if they can find a problem to fit it.
Yeah, absolutely. And then just to justify, I mean, I was just talking about this over the weekend. I think recruitment in every area of work, of sport, staff, whatever, not only sport, in every area is in need of disruption.
No, and this is a really good example, and I want to sort of use it to segue into the next section, where there's been a review of all of these studies that say, when you're doing recruitment, if you say you conduct a suite of assessments, right, you give them a job sample, you test their cognitive ability, you look at their personality, whatever, and then you add an interview, the interview makes you less accurate at predicting they're going to be good at the job.
Wow.
And it's because of all the biases that come in, right? You get a handsome bloke like you come in, Craig, and they're like, God, Craig must be good, right? But it's not just that. It's not just the way people look, although that is sadly much more influential than it should be. You think that because someone presents well in an interview and they can answer something coherently and tell a good story, that they're going to actually be good at their job, even though most people's jobs aren't really related to what it's like in an interview setting. I guess, like, what I want to link this onto is that the only kind of part of the decision-making process that we may not have talked about is this idea of testing our assumptions about things.
Yeah.
Collecting good sort of pieces of information that will tell us if we're wrong. So how can you, as a sports scientist or a leader in sport, like, check your assumptions about stuff, to, like, collect data that will tell you whether or not a player is going to be a good fit, or, whether or not this is the right, dietitian for the team or whatever. How do you check our assumptions? What do we do?
Well, look, I mean, you definitely have to have as much information as you can possibly gather. If it's a player, looking at their, historical work where they've been before, their injury statistics. As much information you can gather will give you greater insight to making a good decision. If we're talking about staff, I'm always interested in trial periods. I think that's very important. That it might be a 12-month contract, but after a few months we can have that discussion to see if it's good for both of us, if this is working out. I also, it is a difficult one. A lot of the jobs are still given on interviews and on resumes. I find it incredible that that's still the case. And it seems to be a lot of people go around and continue to get jobs because they've had jobs previously. And that sort of works out that way. But I think the biggest thing, Michael, is that we need to gather as much information as we can. We can do that if we want to look. I mean, I've seen players recruited, and then I've looked at this player, and then I've gone on Wikipedia and see that they haven't played for 18 months and they scored 1 goal in the last 3 years because they've had hamstring injury after hamstring injury, and then they've just been signed by a club. I can do that on Wikipedia. And I'm thinking to myself, this might astound people listening to this, but it happens. And a couple of years ago, I could only come up with the idea that surely this could only happen if someone is gaining monetarily from this, because I couldn't think of any way this could happen, that people would not go for the insight to gather this data on this person being selected or recruited.
And maybe that all comes back to what you said about the beginning is our desire for confirmation bias, and that we might look up, highlights from Craig Duncan's playing career rather than, Craig Duncan's average performance or things like that. Like, we do tend, and I used to be so guilty of this. I would constantly be putting into Google, evidence for mindfulness, which I wrote my thesis on it because I wanted so desperately to prove that mindfulness was going to be this panacea that would make every athlete just like perform better. Because I just believed it, Craig. I believed it, but believing doesn't make it true, right? Yeah. And so by seeking evidence that might contradict my hypothesis, like I came up with a much more balanced view. But it took me, really solid training and a lot of good mentorship and guidance to get out of that mindset of just wanting something to be true, wanting a player to be a good fit, and then looking for all the evidence that fit that, regardless of how good that evidence was,
But at the end of the day, that's your ego as well. And that's the problem. I mean, it's off topic now, but it's the problem with science today. Students watching this, you'll go to the research and you'll think, okay, it's published and then that's all good. No, I think we've gone away from what really science is. Science is about going, I've got these hypotheses that mindfulness works. Now, I should be Googling, how does mindfulness not work? Because that's basic science, trying to find something, having a hypothesis and trying to prove it wrong. But what we do, and the way the structure is of, I suppose, academia, is that we have a hypothesis and we'll do everything in our power to prove it right, because then it will be published and it will, et cetera, et cetera. And you and I both know we can probably make anything right with statistics if you play around with the data well enough.
There's lies, damn lies, and statistics. And we could have a whole bloody thing on statistics, but I actually am really glad you brought up the whole problems with science, because I think it's really important we talk about it, and this is probably the natural place to bring it up.
Yeah.
And I guess I want to bring up two maybe examples for your reflection. One is that, like you said, with my thesis, I was trying to test whether mindfulness works, and so tried to create the best objective test of that. So it was a really well-designed experiment. The participants were blinded. They were objectively measured on their performance. So we used, radio data to measure there was golfers, and we measured their putting accuracy to the nearest millimeter. So if anything was going to change, I was going to be able to detect it, and massively overpowered it. So they talk about small sample sizes being a problem. We were like, okay, let's quadruple the sample we think we're going to need for this. And lo and behold, we didn't find that mindfulness helped golfers in their putting, after a brief session. Now, it wasn't a long intervention, it was only brief, but like in the putt, like taking everything I'd read about mindfulness, this should have worked, right? So I think one thing which was good about that was like I really tried to give it a rigorous, and I tried to remove all the biases by blinding and randomizing it. But what was the most disappointing thing, which speaks to your point about science, is that we tried to submit this to 6 good sports psychology journals, and they got rejected because they said there must have been something wrong with our intervention or something, right? They refused to believe that mindfulness wasn't working. They said we'd done something wrong because it wasn't working. But I think it speaks to your point about, there are incentives in science, which means that you do end up with these potentially biased results sometimes if they're, because of things like publication bias, where like the things that confirm researchers' beliefs are the ones that get published. And like, I'm wondering if you think that's a case within sports science, because I know that it's certainly the case within psychology research. Like
sports science?
Yeah.
Absolutely, 100%. Sports science research, like all research, is there's a hypothesis, and people go after it. And I've got publications. I think a couple of my best publications are sitting in my computer that got knocked back because we found no difference, and they would have given more to the literature than other information that I found. That has been published. So I mean, I keep it for myself and in my own practice because I know it's the case. But that's where we're at. So there's a significant amount of bias in sports science research. I mean, without getting into too much trouble, like I'll say, we can make anything sing with statistics, and if we want to really prove something right, and it can be done. So I think what we're saying here is be very mindful, which is interesting, mindful of the methodology in the research that you are reading. And just because it's published does not mean it's true. It means that you can write about it in a scholarly article, and you can reference it if that's your way. But please have a look where a lot of the sports science research has been done on. It's the majority of the time it's not done on the athletes that you're actually working with. So
yeah, and look, I agree. I'm trying to not sound like a sort of a jilted lover who's been rejected and therefore is raging against the machine. But I think one sort of continuation of your point, and then one suggestion for students. The continuation of your point is that our secondary outcome, so we prospectively registered, which is sort of a new thing, which is where you say in advance what you're going to do, what your analysis you're going to do, etc. Our secondary outcome was significant, right? So it didn't improve their actual performance, but it improved their sort of swing mechanics. And to your point, any other day, any other year, we would have just gone, mindfulness improves swing mechanics, and like claimed this as this like great victory of mindfulness because it improved this outcome. And we would have just said that this was our primary outcome the whole way along. And so fortunately, I think things in science are changing, which are making it harder to do that. And we also just think it's intellectually dishonest to do that, but it doesn't stop people, right? And we definitely could have easily done that. So I guess that is a bit of a warning, like exactly what you said. Look at the methods, look at whether they've registered it, look at, were people actually double-blinded, stuff like that. But the other thing is that I think there is a solution, or at least something that's more informative for people than sort of relying on these individual studies. And I don't know how prevalent this is or how easy it is to do in sports science, but it happens a lot within medicine, and it's been adapted everywhere else, is using kind of what are called systematic reviews and meta-analyses to make our decisions, right? Yeah. So for the students who don't know what they are, it's like instead of sort of going onto Dr. Google and, finding the top 5 studies on, I don't know, stretching for injury, you you find every single study that's ever been done on stretching for injury prevention. And lo and behold, from my reading of a meta-analysis, and I could be wrong, Craig, because you're the expert, but like stretching is not actually that good for injury prevention as far as a strategy.
Well, that's right. But that's an interesting one too, that, you know, static stretching shouldn't be used in a warm-up because it reduces power, X, Y, and Z. And yes, that might be all true in respect to looking at that, but you've got a player that's been playing for 20 years and he wants to stretch something that's tight because psychologically that's what he does. And I've seen sports science people saying, "Oh, don't do that, Michael." And it's like, well, hang on. If he just does that and he just stretches that's tight and then he gets up and moves again, it would be okay. So we've got to be, even there, we've got to be very careful, because in sports science, we have to remember we're not working with laboratory rats. We're working with humans. And the psychological component of that is so important. And that's my issue. I think a lot of people in sports science see the world in black and white.
They're like, this works or it doesn't. And that's too binary. And maybe like it's a perfect example, Craig, of where like this idea of evidence-based practice gets totally removed from where it came from. And they say, oh, it's just about making a decision on the basis of evidence. And that's not true. Medicine has always said it's about the intersection of three circles, right? Which is using scientific evidence, the patient's values and their preferences. Like the surgery might be the best option, but some people just don't want the surgery, right?
Cool.
And then it's also your clinical judgment as a professional who's been working in this space for a long time. And so that might be, you know, if you're a sports scientist, Craig, you've got a judgment about what's going to work for this player. They're going to have some preferences, like you said, based on 20 years of their experience. And then there's going to be some evidence, and you're trying to use all three, not just one, not just cherry picking evidence from here, not completely ignoring your judgment, but balance all three to make a decision. What do you think of that kind of model of blending those?
Look, I think it's absolutely right. And I think a lot of my success and working with players has come from being open to who they are as a human being as well. Like one of the great ones is recovery. Ice baths don't work. Ice baths, this is the latest. This has to be. It's like, what? Hang on. The fact is, let's see. Yes, we have the evidence. Then we have the player, and then you have to work out what is right for that player. Okay, so if the player doesn't like ice baths, they really do not like an ice bath. Okay, what are we trying to do with the ice bath? We're trying to promote recovery, whatever we're trying to do, what your focal point about that. The literature on it is still a little bit up in the air, but this person gets more stressed out by going into 12 degrees in an ice situation, and they don't really like that. Okay, well, what's the option? You're going to throw them in the ice bath because you've read in an article and your lecturer at some stage told you this is what you've got to do, or you're going to use proper, common sense, basically, and go, okay, if they're not going to use this as recovery, what recovery do you like to do? We know recovery is important, but let's face it, you can live in an ice bath and not get good sleep and good nutrition. You're not going to recover well.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is it's such a minor argument to have, but people in sports science seem to get so caught up with the minuscule things and forget that we're actually working with a human being.
The human at the other end of the iceberg bath. Yeah. And I think it's a balance, and I think people see an emphasis on one and they neglect the other. Like some people say, you've got to integrate the person, and then they get their hackles up and saying, well, what about science? And then you say about science and they say, well, what about the person? And I think people struggle. It comes right back to what we said about having multiple things in your mind at the same time without self-combusting. And I think we need to have, the person there. You also have to be aware of your own judgments, which is what you were saying, and try to integrate that with as much information as you can scientifically. And I guess that sounds like a lot. That sounds like a lot to keep in your mind. And I think the main reason why I recommend systematic reviews and meta-analyses to students is because it's a simpler way of getting all of the evidence rather than necessarily having to keep in mind my judgments, the athlete's preferences, and all of these hundreds of different studies on a topic, And so I think I want people to keep that in mind throughout the rest of this course, that, some of our recommendations will be based on a systematic review. Like we'll talk about it, I won't explicitly talk about it here, but we'll be talking about transformational leadership, because transformational leadership has like these dozens of studies that say it's a good predictor. And that doesn't mean that you have to be a transformational leader if it doesn't necessarily fit your style. You might be better as a servant leader because a servant leader might fit your values and your athletes, you know?
Yep.
And servant leadership also has evidence. What I guess we don't want you doing is going up and being homeopathists who have zero evidence for anything, right? And I guess we're not saying it's easy, right? But we're saying we want to make sure we don't neglect any of those pillars of the stool, right? You don't want to neglect the athlete, you don't want to neglect the science, and you don't want to neglect your own judgment. Would you agree with that sort of?
Absolutely. And look, I think some people harp on about evidence-based, and I'm thinking, yeah, of course we have to have evidence. You know, if we're in a science field, we have to have evidence, but there are multiple places of that evidence. Does that make sense? So then you have to use these other pillars. Sometimes I hear when someone says, "I'm just evidence," but I think, what, did you just hear that lately? And that's your big hammer that you wanna hit with, you know?
Yeah.
Rather than thinking, yeah, of course, you know, if we're in a science field, why are you talking about being evidence based? Because it makes sense that you just would be. And yes, 100%. Even now in my career, I will go always, if I'm looking at something, if I wanted to look at something specific, I would go to a systematic review because it's already done for me.
Yeah.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
It's done for me. I know I can read this article and I can be aware of that rather than going to these multiple articles. It's already been done, so it makes it easier. So yeah, it's a very good point you make about systematic reviews and yeah, and when you've been involved in a systematic review, or, you know, we have students that might do a systematic review. Yeah, look, the rigor in it is good, and so it's a great place to start your reading.
But like you said, they're not always available, and then you're going to have to start using your own judgments. And look, these are all tools, and everything we've talked about today has been a tool to help with decision making. And I think it's great that you brought us to that scientific tool, because ultimately that's a good way of trying to cut through biases. And it's not perfect, like we said, but that's a great way to title this up, Craig. So look, I think hopefully that's a few tools in the toolkit for people to use making decisions, these tough decisions in coaching and leadership. I guess I wanted to put this topic up front to help people understand the sorts of attitude they might take into the rest of the series. And also sort of as a rationale for why we're drawing on some of these sources to kind of bring in new information from different perspectives. We're trying to widen our perspectives a little bit. So
yeah, and I think it'd be great if, I mean, there is multiple decision-making models, okay, but ultimately there are all these that you could put together. It has to be right for you. Yeah. So what we do not want out of this course is that you're a clone of anyone, that you actually get great information from different things and then come up with something that fits in with you in respect to making your decision.
Yeah, no, we want to make sure that you've got tools that fit the problem you're facing, but also that fit you as a person implementing it.